Western Europe, November 1944. A cold mist drifts low over the riverbank. The air smells of diesel and cordite. Charred girders jut out of the water like the bones of a dead giant, the remains of a bridge that once spanned this narrow tributary of the Meuse. On the muddy western bank, a Sherman tank idles, its engine growling softly beneath the grey sky. The crew stands outside, helmets off, staring at the gap before them. 20 meters of swirling, ice-cold water, the only thing standing between them and their objective on the far side, a village held by retreating German infantry. Behind them, other tanks wait in line, tracks sunk deep in the mud, their crews watching with a mixture of impatience and disbelief. No one expects this to work. A sergeant kneels by a coil of rope, his gloves blackened with grease. Another soldier drives a metal spike into the earth. They're not rebuilding the bridge, they're trying something stranger. Someone laughs from a nearby tank. "You're not serious, are you?" The sergeant doesn't answer. He ties the rope tighter, looks across the river, and says quietly, "It's the only way." The wind carries the sound of distant artillery. They called it the rope bridge. But that morning, it would carry a 40-ton Sherman tank. By late autumn of 1944, the war in Western Europe had entered a grinding phase. The euphoria of the Normandy breakout had faded into exhaustion and mud. After the liberation of Paris in August, Allied armies pushed relentlessly eastward toward Germany, but every kilometer came at a higher cost. The German army, though retreating, was far from beaten. Bridges, railways, and roads were methodically destroyed in withdrawal. Every crossing became a trap, every river a new defensive line. The Wehrmacht had perfected the art of denial. If they could not hold the ground, they would make it useless to the enemy. The Allied advance slowed as fuel convoys stretched back hundreds of miles to the beaches of Normandy. Engineers worked day and night to repair what retreating Germans had blown apart. Pontoon bridges floated over the Seine. Bailey bridges rose from rubble in record time. Yet the pace of destruction always seemed faster than reconstruction. Among the armored divisions pressing the advance were the Shermans, the workhorses of the Western Front. The M4 Sherman wasn't glamorous, nor was it invincible. By 1944, many crews knew its flaws all too well: thin armor, high silhouette, and a tendency to burn when hit. But what it lacked in strength, it made up in reliability. It was a tank that kept moving when others stalled. Movement, however, meant little without a path forward. Rivers, once gentle features of the European countryside, became deadly obstacles. In France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, countless bridges had been dropped into the water by retreating German engineers. The Allies' mobility, their greatest advantage, was now under siege from geography itself. Combat engineers did what they could. Prefabricated Bailey bridges, one of Britain's most brilliant wartime inventions, spanned countless rivers. But they required time, flat ground, and heavy equipment, luxuries rarely found under artillery fire. In fast-moving operations, when armored columns found themselves cut off from engineering units, the problem of crossing fell squarely on whoever arrived first. And that was often the tankers. By November, cold rains had turned much of northern France into a grey sea of mud. Rivers swelled beyond their banks, washing away fords and collapsing makeshift crossings. In some sectors, the front lines were advancing faster than the supply columns could keep up. Tank crews found themselves operating in isolation, detached from engineers, radio contact patchy, and orders growing desperate: advance at all costs. It was during one of these chaotic pushes, near the Meuse tributaries, west of the German border, that a small armored platoon encountered a river that wasn't supposed to exist. According to their maps, the bridge had been standing. But when they arrived, it was gone, reduced to twisted steel and floating debris. The Germans had destroyed it just hours before. The mission, however, couldn't wait. The far side held a key road junction leading toward the Siegfried Line, and the infantry was counting on the tanks for fire support. Without armor, the attack would stall. And every delay gave the Germans more time to dig in. So the crews gathered at the bank, staring across the gap, searching for options. The engineers were still miles behind. Command offered no immediate solution, only the same repeated message: find a way across. The men of one Sherman crew, exhausted, soaked, and smeared with mud, began to think differently. Their sergeant, a man known for fixing anything from jammed machine guns to broken track links, examined the wreckage, the ropes, and the current. He sketched something in the mud, a crude diagram that made little sense to anyone else. A rope bridge, strong enough for a tank. It sounded absurd. Even the idea of moving a 30-plus-ton vehicle over ropes and planks was unthinkable. But on that frozen riverbank, with the mission hanging in balance, absurdity sometimes became necessity. That moment, of impossible calculation and reckless courage, didn't happen in isolation. It was born from the relentless pressure of 1944, a war racing toward Germany, but mired in mud and ruin. And the further east the Allies pushed, the more such moments of improvisation would define their advance. Because in that final year of the war, ingenuity became as vital as firepower. These stories aren't just history, they're proof of human courage and sacrifice. If you too salute these heroes, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and become a part of our journey. And don't forget to tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? Let's continue the story. The map identified the place simply as Crossing Point 17. To headquarters, it was another minor river junction west of the Siegfried Line, one of hundreds across northern France and Belgium. But to the men on the ground, it was a wound in the landscape, a black river swollen by rain and winter runoff, winding through farmland flattened by weeks of shelling. The 3rd Armored Division had reached the area in late November 1944. The push toward the German frontier was slowing. Supply convoys struggled through the mire, and every river crossing had become a bottleneck. The Germans, retreating but still disciplined, demolished each bridge behind them in textbook precision. Their engineers had done their work well. Nothing remained intact for long. At Crossing Point 17, the destruction was complete. The bridge's central span had been dropped into the river. Only its skeletal ends remained on either bank. Scattered shell casings and broken timbers littered the approach. A single burnt-out truck smoldered by the road. The first units to arrive, a reconnaissance patrol, reported no enemy on the far side, only the echo of distant mortar fire. Still, orders were clear. The tanks had to cross by nightfall to support the infantry's advance on the nearby village of Givet-sur-Meuse. The bridge was gone, but the enemy would not wait. In situations like this, American armor relied heavily on engineering battalions. But this time, the engineers were delayed by shellfire on the main route. The armored column was alone. A temporary ferry could be constructed, perhaps, but only if they had pontoons. They didn't. The river was too deep to ford, too wide to jump, and too turbulent to swim. The crews gathered at the bank, staring at the churning water. The cold cut through their wet uniforms. Some smoked quietly, others kicked at the mud. The lieutenant in command paced along the edge, binoculars pressed to his chest, scanning the opposite bank for movement. The sergeant of 1 Sherman, the same man who had earned a reputation for improvisation, walked among the wreckage of the destroyed bridge. He studied the bent steel and twisted cables. To others, it was debris. To him, it was material. Nearby, a private noticed the sergeant dragging a length of cable from the wreck. "What's the plan, Sarge?" he asked. "Trying to make one," came the answer. They had ropes. They had steel wire. They had timber scavenged from the bridge's remains and nearby farmhouses. What they didn't have was time. The lieutenant radioed battalion command, explaining the situation. The reply came minutes later, short, crackling, and unyielding. "You must find a way across." The sergeant crouched in the mud, sketching in the dirt with a stick. Others leaned over his shoulder. It looked like nonsense. Lines, angles, loops. "If we can anchor ropes here and here," he muttered, "and brace the weight against the old pilings, maybe we can make something that'll hold us just long enough." Someone laughed. "Hold a tank. On ropes." But the sergeant didn't laugh. "If we wait, we lose the bridgehead. If we try, we might make it." By mid-afternoon, the rain started again, fine and relentless. The ground turned to soup. The men's boots sank with each step. Across the water, A German mortar shell landed somewhere in the trees, reminding everyone that time was running out. The lieutenant finally gave a quiet nod. "All right," he said. "You've got 1 hour. If it collapses, we pull back and wait for the engineers." It was barely permission, but it was enough. The crew set to work. They hauled ropes across the wreckage, tied knots around the remaining bridge pilings, and began stretching lines across the river using the remnants of the old suspension cables. They were improvising in real time, inventing something no manual had ever described. And while they worked, other crews watched from their tanks, shaking their heads, trading jokes. One even offered to record the suicide bridge for posterity. But as dusk began to fall, the laughter quieted. The rope lines were holding. The shape of something new, something possible, was beginning to emerge from the ruin. In the fading light, under the drumming rain, one crew refused to accept that the river was uncrossable. Because in war, sometimes the difference between failure and legend is the courage to attempt the absurd. And at crossing point 17, that moment had arrived. The human angle, courage in the mud. Every war is fought by machines, but decided by men. At crossing point 17, the machines had stopped. Steel, armor, and horsepower meant nothing against the quiet persistence of a river. What remained was willpower, the simple, stubborn refusal to surrender momentum. For the Sherman crew, it wasn't heroism that drove them, but necessity. They were tired. Their uniforms were soaked through, their hands raw from the cold. The sound of artillery had become background noise, like distant thunder. Yet they kept moving, binding ropes, tightening knots, and testing tension with gloved hands. They had no illusions of glory. If the bridge failed, they would die in the water, drowned or crushed beneath their own tank. But to them, staying idle felt worse. The fear of failure had long since dulled. What remained was habit, drilled into them through months of combat. When stuck, keep going. War, by this point, had stripped away all romance. What remained was fatigue, survival, and the strange pride of making something work when it shouldn't. To an outsider, the scene might have looked insane, a handful of mud-caked soldiers trying to lash ropes across a river while shells fell in the distance. But to the men on that bank, it was simply another job. Another impossible task to be met with quiet defiance. And in that grey twilight, soaked to the bone, they embodied something that often goes unseen in history. Not the hero's charge, but the craftsman's persistence, the kind that turns desperation into innovation. The tactical angle, the battle against time. The tactical situation that day was unforgiving. Allied intelligence believed German units were regrouping on the far bank. A road beyond the village led east toward the Siegfried Line, and if the Americans could seize it, they would outflank a fortified sector still holding out further north. Time, not terrain, was the real enemy. If the crossing couldn't be made before nightfall, the Germans would have time to reinforce. Infantry without armor support would be exposed, and the momentum of the offensive would falter. That's what made the tankers' decision so extraordinary. It wasn't just an act of survival, but a tactical necessity. Every commander on that front understood the rhythm of war. When you stopped moving, you started dying. The river had become a wall between orders and execution. Radios crackled with frustration. Logistics teams were stuck miles behind. Engineers were pinned down on a separate route. In that small patch of France, a handful of men faced a decision that mirrored the entire Allied campaign: move forward through ruin or wait for perfection that would never come. The rope bridge plan wasn't just a gamble, it was a bet on momentum itself. Even if the crossing failed, the attempt would buy time, forcing the enemy to react, to reveal positions, to divert attention. And if it succeeded, it would open the way for the rest of the armored column, a local miracle with strategic consequences. The sergeant knew this, even if he didn't say it aloud. For all the laughter and disbelief around him, He wasn't building a bridge for show. He was racing the clock of war, and war, as every soldier knew, waited for no one. The engineering angle. Improvisation under fire. The bridge they built that day wasn't born from blueprints. It was born from instinct, the kind of field improvisation that armies rarely plan for but often depend upon. The sergeant's plan drew from fragments of memory, training in field repair, advice from engineers met months earlier, and the improvisations of other crews who had once dragged their tanks across rivers using makeshift rafts and pulley systems. He knew the basics of tension, weight distribution, and the breaking point of steel cable. He also knew that, on paper, none of it should work. A Sherman weighed more than 30 tons, roughly the equivalent of 15 medium trucks. No rope bridge could hold that. But the plan didn't rely solely on ropes. It used tension cables, anchored to the remains of the bridge's steel pylons, reinforced with scavenged beams and submerged debris that acted as a partial support beneath the hull. It wasn't truly a bridge, more of a suspended pathway that distributed weight for just long enough to allow a single crossing. To test it, the crew began by dragging smaller loads, spare track links, ammunition crates, across one end. The cables groaned but held. Encouraged, they adjusted the angles, tightened the knots, and reinforced the midpoint with timber taken from a ruined farmhouse nearby. The whole thing was part physics, part prayer. Engineering in war is rarely about design. It's about adaptation. Combat engineers might have called it reckless, but history is full of such recklessness that somehow worked. From improvised rafts in the Pacific to snow bridges in the Ardennes, necessity has always forced invention. As the crew tested their final knots, the sergeant stepped back and looked at what they had made. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't even straight. But it was there, something where there had been nothing. And for the first time that day, the impossible began to look merely improbable. The laughter from the other crews had quieted. A few had even stepped closer, watching in wary curiosity. The idea that had begun as madness was taking shape in the mud, and for the men on that riverbank, curiosity was beginning to replace disbelief. Because sometimes, courage doesn't look like a charge, it looks like a handful of soldiers tying knots in the rain, refusing to accept the word impossible. The technological angle, the limits of the Sherman. By 1944, every Sherman crew knew their machine's boundaries as intimately as they knew their own fears. The M4 Sherman was reliable, yes, but not forgiving. It was designed for mobility and production, not miracles. Its suspension, the vertical volute spring system, could handle rough terrain, but not the instability of a floating surface. Its tracks spread weight effectively over soft ground, but only to a point. Any significant tilt, and the center of gravity would shift violently. Once that happened, the tank would roll, and nothing could stop it. The sergeant knew this. That's why his bridge had to hold, not perfectly, just long enough. The ropes weren't meant to bear the full weight. They were meant to balance it, transferring stress between the hull and the surviving bridge supports. A Sherman's average ground pressure was around 13 psi, about the same as a human footstep. That fact gave him a sliver of hope. If the bridge could distribute that pressure across multiple supports, the tank might crawl across without collapsing entirely. Inside the tank, everything was steel and noise. The men trusted their vehicle, but they also feared it. They knew that one wrong angle, one loose cable, one miscalculation could send them into the river like a stone. And yet, this same machine had carried them through hedgerows, over craters, through fire and smoke. It had become more than a weapon. It was their shield, their home, their identity. They had patched it, painted it, named it. It had a soul of sorts. When the sergeant looked at his tank and then at the river, he wasn't just trying to move a vehicle. He was trying to save a companion that had carried them across half of France. In the end, the machine's limits were clear, but the men's were not. The leadership angle, the weight of decision. The lieutenant commanding the platoon was young, barely 24, and burdened with decisions that could break older men. His orders were to reach the far bank before dusk, but no one had told him how. He had two choices: wait for the engineers and risk losing the momentum of the offensive, or allow his crew to attempt something that defied logic. Leaders in war are often judged by their victories. But in moments like this, leadership meant something else: knowing when to let your men take risks that you, yourself, could not control. The lieutenant understood the odds. He knew that if the bridge failed, he would bear responsibility. But he also saw something in his sergeant's determination, a quiet conviction that this wasn't madness, but method. So he gave permission, not with words of encouragement, but with a single nod, the kind of command that carried equal parts trust and resignation. In that nod lay the essence of leadership under fire, the willingness to gamble not with lives recklessly, but with faith in those who had earned it. History often records the generals, the Eisenhowers, the Pattons, the Montgomerys. But wars are held together by lieutenants and sergeants, by nameless decisions made in the rain, unseen by cameras or communiques. That afternoon at Crossing Point 17, leadership was not a speech or an order. It was silence, the quiet transfer of responsibility from one man to another, sealed by a nod and a shared understanding of what had to be done. The enemy angle, watching from the far bank. Across the river, the enemy was watching. Through the mist, from a tree line on the opposite bank, German infantry observed the strange commotion on the Allied side. Their orders had been to delay, not to engage. They were remnants of a retreating unit, tired, under strength, and low on ammunition. Their officer had instructed them to conserve fire until armor attempted to cross. So they waited. When they saw movement near the destroyed bridge, they expected engineers. But what they witnessed instead confused them: men in tank uniforms hauling ropes, dragging beams, hammering supports. No cranes. No pontoons. Just soldiers tying cables into the wreckage. At first, they laughed. Through binoculars, one German corporal reportedly muttered to his comrade, "Amerikanisch Narren," American fools. But the laughter faded as the structure began to take shape. They saw the ropes tighten, the cables rise, the faint outline of a makeshift crossing forming between the broken girders. One of the German sergeants lowered his binoculars and whispered, "Das kann nicht funktionieren," that cannot work. Yet curiosity replaced contempt. A few even ceased their fire entirely, uncertain whether to interfere or simply watch this bizarre act unfold. It was one of the strange, quiet moments in war when two sides, enemies by fate, found themselves witnessing the same impossible defiance of reason. And as the American tank's engine roared to life later that evening, echoing across the water, more than one German soldier stood motionless in disbelief. They had seen countless acts of destruction, but almost never an act of creation. The moment was drawing near. The bridge was ready, the rope strained and trembling under tension. The water below churned dark and cold, reflecting the dull orange of distant artillery fire. The crew climbed back into their Sherman. The lieutenant raised a hand. Engines rumbled. Eyes watched from both banks, some with doubt, others with awe. The air seemed to hold its breath. What began as laughter was now silent anticipation. And in that silence, the impossible would be tested. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick with fog. The last light of evening clung weakly to the clouds, turning the river into a ribbon of dull silver. The bridge, if it could be called that, sagged slightly under its own weight. Two main cables, scavenged from the ruined span, stretched across the water, anchored deep into the mud and steel remnants of the original pilings. Between them, wooden planks and crossbeams were lashed together with wire, rope, and sheer hope. It swayed gently, like something alive. The sergeant stood at the tank's front track, staring at it in silence. His crew gathered around, waiting for him to speak. None of them did. They all knew what this was. There would be no second attempt. The lieutenant approached, his boots squelching in the mud. "You're sure about this?" The sergeant didn't look away from the river. "No, sir." That was the only honest answer possible. They climbed back into the Sherman, 5 men in a steel box that smelled of oil, cordite, and fear. The driver took his position, hands trembling slightly on the controls. The gunner and loader sat ready, though there would be no firing on this crossing. The radio operator adjusted the headset, catching fragments of chatter from the other crews watching nearby. "God help them," someone murmured over the net. The sergeant's voice came through, calm and even. "All right. Easy gear. Keep her steady." The tank's engine rumbled to life, low and steady, the exhaust coughing out a cloud of grey smoke. The sound filled the valley, deep, rhythmic, relentless. With a metallic clank, the Sherman inched forward. The first track met the wooden planks with a hollow thud. The bridge sagged slightly but held. A creak echoed across the water, followed by the groan of stressed metal. "Keep her centered," the sergeant said. The tank advanced another meter. The rope strained, vibrating under tension. The water below churned and slapped against the broken pilings. On the far bank, the German observers remained still, their disbelief growing with every second. Through binoculars, one could see the tank's nose dipping slightly as it crept onto the bridge, its tracks grinding against the planks, leaving deep impressions in the wood. At 30 tons, the Sherman moved like a beast testing thin ice, cautious, deliberate, unstoppable. Half the tank was now on the bridge. The structure bowed, the cables humming under the strain. A plank cracked, splintering beneath the track, but the ropes redistributed the load, keeping the hull balanced. The entire crossing became a symphony of tension, ropes creaking, wood snapping, steel groaning, and the engine roaring over it all. The sergeant kept his eyes on the forward periscope. His voice, steady but tight, guided the driver by inches. "Left a touch, now hold it. That's it. Keep your line." From the riverbank, the other crews watched in breathless silence. The laughter from earlier had long vanished. Even the rain seemed to pause. Then came a sound, sharp and violent. One of the rear support beams snapped clean in two. The bridge dipped dangerously. The tank lurched forward, its rear track sliding slightly to the left. Inside, hearts stopped. The sergeant's hand shot to the intercom switch. "Power! Don't stop!" The driver obeyed instinctively, pressing down. The engine roared, gears grinding as the tank clawed forward. Mud, water, and debris sprayed into the air. The bridge screamed under the load, but the ropes, those improbable lifelines, held fast. The front track reached solid ground on the opposite bank, throwing up clods of earth as it bit into stability. The tank surged ahead another meter, then another. The rear section of the bridge twisted violently, one of the cables snapping loose with a whip crack that echoed like gunfire. The rear track lifted for a terrifying moment, then slammed down onto the far bank with a thunderous crash. Silence. The engine idled, hissing softly in the cold air. The rope still trembled, a few strands hanging torn and useless above the water. But the Sherman stood, solid, immovable, on the far side. For a moment, no one moved. The crew sat frozen inside, listening to the metallic ticking of the engine cooling. On the western bank, the men who had mocked them minutes earlier stood speechless, their helmets glinting in the pale light. Then, slowly, the sergeant opened the hatch. Steam poured out. He climbed halfway out, resting one arm on the turret. His face was streaked with mud, his expression unreadable. He looked back across the river. On the far bank, The lieutenant raised a hand in salute. And somewhere in the tree line across the water, one of the German observers lowered his rifle. The enemy did not fire. Not a single shot. Because for a brief moment, both sides of the river, Allied and German, had witnessed something that defied every rule of war. They had watched a tank drive across ropes and willpower. And it had made it. As the sergeant climbed down to check the cables, the wind carried a faint sound across the valley. Not laughter, but applause, scattered and hesitant, from the men on the western bank who had doubted him. He didn't wave back. He just placed a hand on the cable, still trembling, and whispered to no one in particular. It held. But the night was not over. The far bank was only half secured, and danger still waited beyond the village. The river had been crossed, yes, but the war had not. Night fell over crossing point 17 like a slow descent of smoke. The fog thickened, mingling with the acrid scent of fuel and wet steel. The river, disturbed by the tank's passage, churned with debris, broken planks, snapped ropes, fragments of the bridge that had barely survived its ordeal. On the far bank, the Sherman idled on solid ground, its headlights dimmed, its crew still processing what they had just done. Behind them, the remains of the rope bridge swayed and groaned in the wind. Half of it hung useless, torn from its anchors, one end dipping into the cold current like a defeated banner. But it had done its job. The sergeant stepped down from the tank and crouched near the water's edge. He touched the steel cable, its surface frayed and slick with mud. For a moment, he said nothing, just stared at the trembling line that had held the impossible. Across the river, the lieutenant organized the next phase. He was already on the radio, his voice crisp and calm now. Bridge is compromised, but one vehicle made it. Repeat, one vehicle is across. Command's reply was static-filled but unmistakably astonished. Say again. A tank crossed? Yes, sir, the lieutenant answered. The bridge held. A pause followed, then, hold the far bank. Reinforcements are en route. That was all. But those words, the bridge held, spread like electricity through the battalion network. Within minutes, other units were asking if it was true. A Sherman had crossed a rope bridge. It sounded like nonsense, like a field rumor born of fatigue. Yet every witness on the western bank had seen it with their own eyes. Soon headlights appeared in the fog. Infantrymen began to arrive, moving carefully along the riverbank, guided by the light of signal lamps. The tank crew waved them toward a narrow patch of shoreline where the ground was firm. The infantry would cross later, once engineers arrived. But for now, the first armored vehicle was across, and that meant something powerful, a foothold. The Germans, silent until now, stirred in the darkness. Mortar shells began to fall sporadically, splashing into the river or exploding harmlessly in the mud. But the tank's presence on the far bank changed everything. Its gun elevated, scanning the tree line, its crew ready. At 2,200 hours, the Sherman fired its first round across the river, not in anger, but in assertion. The blast echoed through the valley, a thunderclap that seemed to declare, "We are here." For the men still on the western bank, it was a moment of shared disbelief that turned into pride. They watched as the flash from the tank's muzzle lit the fog like a brief sunrise. That same crew, covered in mud, had done what no one thought possible, and in doing so, had given their unit back its momentum. By midnight, the first engineers had reached the site. They stared at the remains of the rope bridge in silence, half in admiration, half in horror. One of them reportedly muttered, "Whoever built that should be dead or promoted." The sergeant didn't respond. He was too busy helping reposition the cables for the infantry crossing. His hands bled from rope burns. His face was smeared with grease and soot. Yet he moved with quiet precision, like a man performing a ritual. Across the radio, Battalion Command transmitted new orders. Hold the bridgehead. Prepare for armor support by morning. It was official. The crossing wasn't madness anymore. It was now part of the plan. On the far bank, the Sherman's crew found cover among the ruins of a small farmhouse. They shut down the engine to conserve fuel, the sudden silence almost overwhelming. The air was still, broken only by the faint hiss of cooling metal. Inside the tank, the crew sat in the dim glow of instrument lights. No one spoke for several minutes. Finally, the driver broke the silence. "I didn't think she'd make it." The sergeant gave a small, tired smile. "Neither did I." That was the only ceremony they ever had. No speeches, no medals, just that quiet acknowledgement in the dark. As dawn approached, the fog began to lift. Across the water, engineers were already at work constructing a proper Bailey Bridge. Trucks and bulldozers churned toward the site, following the path cleared by that one improbable crossing. The lieutenant, now coordinating from the command jeep, glanced across the water at the Sherman on the far bank, its silhouette faint in the morning haze. "Tell them they did it," he said to the radio operator. "Tell them we're moving again." By sunrise, the first rays of light touched the damaged cables, still strung like veins across the river. Birds rose from the trees, startled by the hammering of new bridgework. The rope bridge that had carried one tank was gone by midday, dismantled, salvaged for parts, replaced by steel and order. But its story lingered. Soldiers passing through the sector spoke of it in canteens and bivouacs, the Sherman that crossed on ropes. Some laughed, some doubted, but those who had seen it never forgot. And for the men who built it, that memory was enough. They had not only crossed a river, they had crossed a threshold in their own minds. The war still raged to the east, the Siegfried Line still loomed ahead, but now they carried proof of something rare, that human will, bound with rope and courage, could bear even the weight of a tank. The Sherman's tracks pressed deep into the mud of the far bank, leaving marks that filled slowly with rainwater, quiet reminders of the moment when impossibility gave way to resolve. And in the days that followed, those who crossed after them would see those tracks and know, someone had dared first. Someone had refused to wait for the perfect bridge. By the time the sun cleared the tree line, the crossing site had transformed from chaos into an organized miracle. The engineers, now fully deployed, worked methodically to replace the shattered rope span with a Bailey Bridge, steel, riveted, reliable. But among the crews, there was a different kind of work taking place, the quiet realization that they had witnessed something extraordinary. 4 days, the story spread like wildfire through the 3rd Armored Division. Not through official channels at first, but through whispered retellings at supply trucks, field kitchens, and mess tents. It always began the same way. You hear about the Sherman that crossed on ropes. Some dismissed it as a rumor, a bit of frontline folklore. But soon, photographs began to circulate, grainy images captured by a combat cameraman who had been nearby. One frame showed the tank halfway across, cables bent to their limit, water splashing below. Another showed the crew standing on the far bank, their faces a mix of disbelief and exhaustion. No one could argue with the evidence. Reports reached regimental headquarters within 48 hours. Engineers studied the photographs and the crude schematics drawn in mud and pencil by the sergeant himself. They wanted to know how the bridge held, what materials, what knots, what tension ratios. What they found was staggering. The improvised span had carried nearly 31 tons across a structure designed for no more than 5. It wasn't supposed to work. But it had. Field Command issued a commendation, unofficial at first, then formalized weeks later, praising the crew's initiative under extreme conditions. The sergeant's name appeared in dispatches, not for heroism in combat, but for extraordinary technical improvisation. The Army Corps of Engineers quietly analyzed the crossing in their reports on field engineering tactics. A memo dated March 1945 described it as an exceptional case of combat expedience demonstrating the psychological and operational value of field innovation. That phrase, combat expedience, would later become part of U.S. Army engineering doctrine, though few would ever trace it back to a muddy riverbank in the Ardennes. Meanwhile, on the ground, the impact was immediate and deeply human. For the men who had mocked the idea, the event became a lesson in humility. One of them, a corporal from another Sherman crew, later recalled in an oral interview, "We thought they were out of their minds. When we saw that tank sitting on the far bank, it was like seeing a ghost. It changed what we thought was possible." That shift, from doubt to belief, was worth more than any commendation. Because by late 1944 and early 1945, the Allied advance through Western Europe was as much a battle of morale as of steel. Every bridge destroyed, every river crossed, every delay chipped away at the men's resolve. Yet one act of defiance against the odds rekindled that spark. It reminded them that even amid exhaustion, human ingenuity could still bend the rules of war. At the regimental command post, the lieutenant who had first approved the attempt was quietly debriefed. When asked why he had allowed it, he replied simply, "Because they believed they could." It wasn't bravado. It was trust, the rarest commodity on the battlefield. That night, he wrote in his journal, "I saw a bridge made of ropes hold a tank. I don't know if it was luck or faith. Maybe both. But I know now that courage is a kind of engineering, too." His words never made it into any official record. But they capture the quiet truth of that crossing, that war is not only fought with steel and numbers, but with imagination and the refusal to surrender to impossibility. By the time the division advanced eastward, the river was forgotten by maps but not by memory. The ropes had been dismantled, the mud tracks washed away, yet among the men of the company, the rope bridge remained a symbol. Whenever an impossible order came down, a blown bridge, an impassable road, a stalled advance, someone would mutter, half joking, "Maybe we should call the rope bridge boys." And everyone understood what it meant. Try anyway. The act that began in doubt had become legend in purpose. But legends, like rivers, flow onward, and soon the consequences reached beyond that single crew, beyond that valley, into the broader war effort that was now pressing toward Germany. And as Allied command realized the power of what had been accomplished there, the lesson began to take form, not just about bravery, but about the evolving spirit of modern warfare. In the weeks that followed, the front moved eastward, through forests, villages, and the shattered remnants of the Siegfried Line. The war was nearing its brutal end, but the lessons learned at that nameless river crossing refused to fade. To the engineers, it became a case study in improvisation. To the tank crews, it was proof that ingenuity could outmatch fear. And to commanders watching the final months of the war unfold, it was a small but shining reminder that initiative, even reckless initiative, often carried the day. By March 1945, the U.S. Army was preparing to breach the Rhine, Germany's last great natural defense. Bridges had been destroyed for miles, and the challenge of crossing under fire loomed large. When engineers began sketching alternate solutions, ferries, pontoons, even cable systems, one major reportedly referenced the rope bridge incident as evidence that unorthodox structures can bear unexpected loads when correctly tensioned. It wasn't an order, but it was an inspiration. The courage of one small crew and their improvised crossing had echoed into the planning rooms of larger operations, a ripple effect born from necessity and grit. Far from headquarters, in the mud and ruin of the front line, the men who had built and crossed that bridge were still fighting. Their Sherman, scarred by months of combat, continued to roll east, part of the armored columns cutting toward the heart of Germany. Whenever the terrain turned impossible, swamps, craters, blown embankments, other units called for engineers or bulldozers. But that crew often found their own way through. One corporal later recalled in an interview decades later, "They were different after that river. You could see it. They didn't wait for orders to fix things, they just figured it out. Rope, wire, scrap metal, whatever it took." That spirit, the belief that obstacles could be solved, not just endured, became a quiet current running beneath the last Allied push. When victory finally came in May 1945, Europe exhaled. The tanks that had fought from Normandy to the Rhine rolled into peacetime silence. Some were scrapped, others sent home for display. The rope bridge cruise Sherman survived a little longer, serving as a training vehicle before being decommissioned. Its hull bore scars of shell fragments, and on one side panel, faintly scratched beneath layers of grime, was a single word, bridge. No one ever admitted who carved it. Years later, when veterans gathered to tell their stories, the rope bridge crossing resurfaced, not in official war records, but in conversations that always began with disbelief and ended with quiet respect. At a reunion in the 1960s, the old lieutenant, now retired, met the sergeant again. They spoke of that night in brief, almost reluctant sentences, as if revisiting something sacred. The sergeant reportedly said, "It wasn't bravery. It was just what had to be done." The lieutenant nodded. "That's all bravery ever is." Military historians later classified the event as a spontaneous engineering feat, a category of battlefield improvisations that shaped outcomes without ever appearing in formal strategies. But those who study the human side of war saw something more profound, a moment when invention and willpower converged under pressure. The rope bridge itself, rebuilt and then dismantled, never reappeared. The river remains unnamed in most records, its coordinates lost in the shifting lines of wartime maps. Yet its story persisted through fragments, photos, field notes, and the memories of men who once stood on its banks, waiting for the impossible to collapse, and instead watched it hold. For the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the crossing became part of an internal lecture series on adaptive combat construction. One slide, rarely shown to outsiders, featured a black-and-white photo of a Sherman poised halfway across a sagging bridge. Below it, the caption read simply, "Every bridge begins as a question." And perhaps that was the truest legacy. Not the bridge itself, or the tank, or the medals that never came, but the idea that questions like "can it be done?" still mattered in a world trying to measure everything by numbers and certainty. Because war, for all its structure, still depended on men who dared to test the limits of their tools and themselves. By the time the last veterans of that crossing grew old, the river had changed course. Trees grew where cables once stretched. Birds nested where the bridge had swayed. Nature, indifferent and eternal, reclaimed the ground. But history does not forget courage that defied its own logic. In the archives of the 3rd Armored Division Museum, a faded report remains, stamped Field Engineering, January 1945. Inside, one line stands alone, underlined in pencil. Improvised structure withstood full tank weight under combat stress. Crew and bridge survived intact. That single sentence outlived the bridge, the war, and the men who crossed it. And it continues to remind us, long after the guns fell silent, that sometimes the smallest victories carry the heaviest weight. The ropes may have frayed. The bridge may have vanished. But the story, the moment when courage outweighed fear, endured. And so, too, did its lesson. History often remembers great battles by their names: Normandy, Arnhem, the Bulge. But hidden beneath those names are smaller stories, measured not in territory or tonnage, but in moments when men refused to stop trying. The rope bridge crossing was one of them. No medals were awarded. No monument marks the spot. Yet it remains one of those quiet miracles that reveal what war does to human resolve. In the heart of chaos, amid the rain, the exhaustion, and the ruin, A handful of men looked at an impossible river and decided that impossible wasn't good enough. They trusted cables scavenged from wreckage, their own judgment, and each other. And somehow, that trust held 30 tons of steel across a gap that logic said would break. It was not a victory of machines, but of minds. Because wars are not won only by superior firepower or strategy. They are won by moments like this, when courage and ingenuity intersect, when reason yields to necessity, and when men choose action over fear. The rope bridge did not alter the course of the war, but it changed the men who built it, and those who witnessed it. It became proof that courage is not always loud or visible. Sometimes it's just the sound of rope under tension, of engines idling in the fog, of a man whispering to himself, "Keep her steady." And long after the guns fell silent, the spirit of that moment lived on, in every soldier, engineer, or dreamer who faced an obstacle too heavy to bear and chose to build anyway. Because in the end, that's what the bridge truly was. Not a structure of rope and timber, but a line of faith stretched across doubt. It held, not because it was strong enough, but because they were.